In 1965, 40 bishops made a secret promise in Rome, and nearly all of them broke it. That vow wasn't written down. No official record exists in any Vatican archive, yet it changed how the Catholic Church would operate for decades, and almost nobody knows it happened. The story starts not with the promise itself, but with the men who felt they had to make one and what they were reacting to. October 1962. Vatican II opens. It's a council, a gathering of bishops from across the world, called by Pope John XXIII to modernize the church. Right here, in these early sessions, something crystallizes. Some bishops, particularly those from Latin America, look around at the marble and gold and ask a question that no one's supposed to ask. Why does Christ's church live like a prince when Christ lived like a pauper? These weren't radical priests spouting Marxist theory in underground cells. They were bishops, men in the institutional hierarchy. But they'd seen something the Roman establishment hadn't yet. Poverty, real poverty. In their dioceses, in their parishes, in the faces of people their church was supposed to serve. And they were troubled by the disconnect. By 1965, Vatican II is in its final year. The Council's documents are being finalized, and on this particular day, the exact date is lost to history, which is itself telling. A group of bishops gather in the catacombs beneath Rome. The catacombs, not a boardroom, not a chapel, an underground cemetery where early Christians worshipped in secret, where they buried their dead, where they lived without wealth or status. The symbolism is deliberate. They chose that location because it meant something. Down there, surrounded by the bones of the early church, they made their promise to live as the poor live, to renounce luxury, to give away their wealth, to actually practice what their church preached. Around 40 bishops took this vow. Most of their names were never recorded. Here's what they didn't know yet. In just a few months, the council would end. The documents would be published, and the church would begin its slow walk back toward the center of power. Not immediately, not obviously, but steadily. The bishops who made this promise in the dark were about to find out how hard it is to live like the poor when the institution around you still expects you to live like a prince. Let's move forward. 1966, a year after the Pact, some signatories actually tried to honor it. Bishop Hélder Câmara of Brazil began giving away his possessions. He moved into a modest residence. He spoke publicly about the church's obligation to the poor. Others did similar things, selling episcopal properties, living simply, pushing their dioceses toward what they'd promised. But institutional gravity is real. Rome didn't forbid the Pact, it simply ignored it. The Vatican's infrastructure didn't change. The church's property holdings didn't shrink. And bishops who pushed too hard found themselves sidelined, reassigned, or quietly pressured to moderate their message. The institution had survived the Reformation. It would survive this, too. By the 1970s, the Pact of the Catacombs had become what historians call a memory, something that happened, that people remembered, but that the system had effectively neutralized. The bishops who signed it aged. Some died. Others retreated into comfortable retirement. A few, like Câmara, remained committed, but they became exceptions, not the rule. What's fascinating, and what you have to hold in your mind, is that this wasn't failure because the bishops were weak. It was failure because institutions are stronger than individuals. Even 40 bishops, even gathered in the catacombs, even making sacred vows, they were asking the church to fundamentally reshape itself. And the church, as an institution, doesn't do that quickly. It bends, it absorbs, it survives. There's an irony here worth noting. The very act of going underground into the catacombs to make a secret vow, it was a brilliant symbolic gesture. But secrecy is also what doomed it. A public commitment, a named covenant, might have held more weight. Instead, the pact lived in whispers. It became legend, and legends are easier to ignore than manifestos. The pact didn't disappear entirely. Liberation theology emerged in the 1970s and 80s, partly inspired by the same impulse that drove those bishops underground, the conviction that the church must serve the poor, not the powerful. Some historians argue the pact was its spiritual precursor, a blueprint that never got built, but that inspired others to try. By the 1990s and 2000, most of the original signatories were gone. The pact became a footnote in church history, mentioned in academic papers, discussed in seminaries, but rarely in mainstream discourse. It's the kind of story that historians know but the public doesn't. A road not taken. A promise kept by some, broken by most, absorbed by the institution that had no choice but to acknowledge it existed. What makes this story matter now, what makes it worth remembering, is what it reveals about how institutions respond to internal moral challenge. The Pact of the Catacombs wasn't a failure of individuals. It was a collision between idealism and structural inertia. And that collision happens everywhere. In governments, in corporations, in every system where individuals try to change the system from within. The bishops in those catacombs made a genuine promise. They meant it. But they were also men embedded in an institution older than most nations. And that institution, for all its talk of reform and modernization, was never going to voluntarily strip away its wealth and power. It would talk about poverty. It would write documents about it. But it would keep its gold. The Pact of the Catacombs remains one of history's most compelling and most forgotten moments. A secret vow made in darkness by men who wanted the light of their church to shine on the poor. What they didn't anticipate was that institutions move slower than individual conscience. And sometimes, the most radical act isn't to make a promise. It's to admit that the system itself may be too rigid to keep it. Subscribe to uncover more hidden moments where institutions reshaped history, often without anyone noticing.